Elisa, you can begin. Hello, Elisa. You can begin now.
I think she's on mute.
Hello, good morning. We are Group MC7 with members of Din Dong, Yuan Chen, Jian Ding, and me, myself, Elisa Lee. Today, we will present our studies on the groups who are vulnerable in housing affordability by analyzing the social and demographic factors. First, we will begin with looking into the group who are financially in debt before the pandemic. Second, we will search the group who are impacted during the COVID-19 by tracing the factors like CRD, renter, unemployment rate, education, and etc. Lastly, we will talk about the most vulnerable group so that the federal and provincial government would prioritize them on applying the housing policies. First, pandemic has influenced various social and economic impacts in Canada since 2019. However, there were already debtors who were in financial difficulties. By looking into the characters of this debtors group, we can estimate that the vulnerable groups during the COVID-19. According to the Canadian government data, the male with a 35 to 50-year-old range living in urban area tend to be more like debtors. When comparing this debtors income versus expense, all the age groups spend more expense than the family income. Moreover, housing expense versus income shows over 37%, which is much higher than the average housing affordability index of average 34%. Looking at the region, there's a similar tendency of debtors housing expense around 40% in all provinces except Yukon. Next. Since the debtors expense are higher than the income, and the housing expense took the highest position in the expense, around expense, we could assume that they could be supported. They could be supported on housing that will be very supportive to them to solve their financial difficulties. Lastly, the last chart distribute the merit has been in more individual bankruptcy than the merit except Ontario. Next. Overall, total number of people in the insolvency numbered more than the 140,000. And among them, 57,000 were actually in bankruptcy. And Quebec and Ontario debtors distribute more than 60% among all. However, the number dropped 30% to less than 100,000 in the 2020 during the pandemic. What factors has been the influence to support this debtors group? Bin will take a more closer look at what kind of factors has been influenced them.
Thanks, Elisa. Yeah, thanks, Elisa. How to measure the impact of the pandemic? We can use the unemployment rate, household income, housing price index, or other indicators. In our study, we found that CRB application to employment ratio can be a good indicator. The government gives financial support to employed and self-employed Canadians who are directly affected by COVID-19 through CERB. For certain groups of people, the higher the CERB application to employment ratio, the more money they will need to survive and the more tough situation they are in. So that is our hypothesis about this indicator. Of all Canadian provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador has the highest CERB application to employment ratio, while Saskatchewan and Manitoba have the lowest ratio. But the differences between the other provinces are quite small. We still don't know what causes the differences among provinces during the pandemic. Next slide, please. In this bar chart, the group age under 24 and over 65 have a higher CERB application to employment ratio. So according to our hypothesis, the two groups are more vulnerable. It may have something to do with their competitiveness in the workplace. Younger and older employees are less competitive, so they are more likely to be laid off in the recession. Next slide, please. In this graph, the proportion of females applying for CERB is higher than that of the males. Females seems to be more vulnerable to the pandemic, but there is no big difference between the two groups. Next slide, please. Okay, we also researched whether renters are affected by COVID-19. First, we compared the average household income between renters and the house owners from 2006 to 2016. As we can see, renters only are almost half as much as homeowners. The income difference is relatively constant over the long term. Because renters have lower income, I believe once the economic crisis happens, renters will be more vulnerable. Next slide, please. In addition, as of September 2020, renters had higher expired deferrals on auto loans and credit cards than homeowners, which also means that when the pandemic came, more renters were facing personal financial crisis. Next slide, please. We also want to know which types of renters are more vulnerable. For those who spend over 30% of income on rent in Ontario, those aged 15 to 29 and over 65 have higher proportions. This is highly consistent with the previous finding. The youngest and the oldest have difficulties in rent affordability. Now, next slide, please. Finally, we investigated the rent affordability of different family types. The single families have worse rent affordability than those of the couple families. And the rent affordability of female single with kids is the worst one. In general, by studying CERB and the renters, we found that those groups are more vulnerable. The first one is female. The second is aged under 24 and over 65, renting a house, and single with kids. So they need more support from the government. I will hand over to Eric.
Thanks, Bing. So this part we'll talk about the unemployment rate. Unemployment rate has been identified to be associated with housing affordability. We believe that exploring the rate is helpful for identifying the vulnerable population who may face the housing affordability. This plot focuses on males. We can see that each line represents the different age group and the X is time. In males, The age group of the 15 to 19 and the 20 to 24 years, the both group have the higher unemployment rates. Especially you can see after just the beginning of the COVID-19, they both have a steep increase in unemployment rate. Next, please. This plot is focused on in females. The situation is similar to males. The age group 15 to 19 and 20 to 24 years, they both also have higher unemployment rates. So the key question is why young population faced a higher unemployment rate. Some researchers say many youth worked in service sector such as the food and the accommodation. And investigation also found that almost 40% of the young population work in those sectors, and those sectors were affected most by the pandemic. Next, please. And regarding the unemployment rate by education, our result found that the group with the some post-secondary or some high school had a higher unemployment rate since the last March, and with a peak in May 2020. These people did not complete their education. Some researchers say the most less educated worker usually were essential worker. When the pandemic started, they were less likely to work from home and have a higher risk of dismissal due to the reason. Next, please. And about the unemployment rate by industrial, we found there are two industrial have a higher unemployment rate. They are accommodation and the food services and the culture and the recreation. Even if their unemployment rate shows a significant drop after May 2020, overall, they still have a higher unemployment rate than others during the pandemic. Next, please. Regarding to the average weekly wage rate, we can see the industry, accommodation and the food service also had the lowest average weekly wage rate, range from the 618 to 719, followed by agriculture. Next, please. And the other one, regarding to the total number of job index, the index shows the change of the number of the job. There were two industrial that show a significant decrease in job opportunity. There are accommodation and the food service, and the other one is arts related sector. Also, the two industrial with less job opportunity compared to others. Some researchers found that this sector made a really outsized contribution to the increase in the long-term unemployment rate. Next, please. In addition to unemployment rate, there are also the other one important factor is mental health. Investigation result from Statistics Canada. The question is, and found compared to pre-pandemic, the percentage of individuals who feel somewhat worse or much worse now is higher in younger population. For example, you can see in the plot, in the end of the last year, near 45% of the young population, especially the 18 to 13 years old, with the worst mental health. So the two factor is very important to help us to identify which kind of people may face higher housing affordability and the vulnerable group. So next we'll hand over to Jem.
Thanks, Eric. Firstly, I'm going to introduce the average percentage spending on shelters in Canada by provinces. On the graph, Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia are the top three provinces that has most average spending on shelters. For the living alone in Canada, from year 1981 to year 2016, the percentage of people who lives alone have increased for 4%, and there are more females who lives alone than males. Why people living alone are facing more risks due to the housing affordability crisis. Individuals who live alone have to pay their expenses on their own, including housing expense, utilities, transportation, food, and entertainment. However, for those who live in a household with others, they can take advantage of economies of scale in managing those expenses. Most of people live alone with monthly shelter costs considered not affordable, which means they are spending 30% or more of their average monthly of their income at housing expense. And the shelter costs are particularly expensive for young adults who live alone in 2016, close to half of the population, and it means 50% of young adults are spending more than half of their household income on housing expenses. So basically, first-time home buyers, they needed to they are the group of people who needed to buy a house at the most. They needed the home the most, and the larger proportion for the first-time home buyers, they are young populations. Between on the graph, it shows 47% of first-time home buyers are young populations, ages between 25 to 34 years old. From this, we notice that there's a large proportion of people who are vulnerable in housing affordability crisis, which is young adults. And in conclusion, the vulnerable group in the pandemic, due to the applicants' report by CERB, we noticed that young adults age under 24 and adults age over 65, they are more vulnerable. Also, females are slightly more vulnerable than males. According to the unemployment research, according to the research based on unemployment rate, we noticed that females are more vulnerable than males. People having lower education is more vulnerable than people who has higher education, and people working in accommodations or food service industries are facing a higher risk of housing affordability crisis. And also for mental health, the entire population in Canada had the impact on mental health by the pandemic, but the most vulnerable group with mental health is young adults. Young adults aged between 18 to 34 are having a worsening situation overall. High risk population in housing affordability crisis. For this part, I'm gonna use a hashtag like in Twitter's to introduce you the the features that makes a certain group more vulnerable. First, we have renters, and then hashtag to young adults, and first-time home buyers, single mothers, living in urban areas, people who live alone. And the last, we show all of us are, we are residents in Ontario, because Ontario has the highest percentage spending on housing based on their income. How to support the vulnerable groups? For federal government, I think government can provide more benefits like CERB, and for provincial government, they can provide priorities on placing on the social housing. Thanks for watching.
All right, thank you very much for your presentation. We will now have some questions from the judges based on your presentation.
Perfect. Maybe I can start. Great job, team. I think you've done a great job finding all this data and analysis. I know how difficult it is to connect the dots sometimes. I wanted to dig in a little bit more and get a better understanding. When you were looking at your data around SERB, female, and ages, did you have an opportunity to also look at where are the areas that there's overlapping between, for instance, the female single parents who applied for SERBs, or people that they were in certain age and they apply for SERB? Because as part of the experiences I've seen in a banking, you may need to go a little bit deeper to see who is the really group that has been impacted and have a very targeted offer for those, or opportunity or solution.
Yeah, this is a good question. Thank you. I have looked into the details, such as the CRB data, and I don't see any overlap between ages and the sex. They have different data sets to describe different stories about ages and the sex. And maybe there are some data sets there on the internet or in Statistics Canada or somewhere else. We will dig into it into to find more details. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I'm going to give the chance to the other judges if they have any questions. So maybe I'll ask one more question. Around renters, you guys, from what I understood from your presentation, it seems like the biggest part was the renters. It seems like you focus a lot on renters, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So as part of SERB, or did you guys, I want to go back and get a better understanding. Did you not find any evidence as mortgage people that they have mortgage and they actually work in a service industry, or they have worked in, I think you talk about entertainment and health and services industry are the two areas that did you guys didn't find any data that people they actually have mortgage have been more impacted, or they have applied for SERBs?
In the phase one competition, we find the matches between the prime rate and the housing affordability index in the past 40 years, and there is a relationship between the mortgage rate, yeah, and the housing affordability, but oh, sorry. But the mortgage, if somebody have a house and they have to support, they have to spend money on the mortgage. We don't have that. They don't have that kind of data. Sorry.
I was just curious to see if there was the people that are apply for SERBs, they have like their own mortgages, because that's or they do deferral, because there's the banks has introduced something like deferral, and they were able to put their mortgages on hold for a number of years, so, or a few months, sorry. So that might have shown some of the vulnerability, but I was just curious if that information was available to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. It is a good question, but I have something to add on about the group of people, renters between and people who have mortgages. In our study, we we did find out renters are actually more vulnerable than people who is having have a mortgage, no matter what kind of mortgage, because in Canada, there is research shows people who can afford them actually as long as you can pay the down payment for a mortgage, the mortgage is actually much more cheaper than renting a place. So if no one is dumb, like they were definitely chose have a mortgage. So the reason they are choosing to rent a place is because they don't have enough down payments. So which means due to housing affordability crisis, like people who are renting a house, renters are definitely more vulnerable than people who already have a mortgage.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
Can I just get in on that issue about mortgage? I'm not sure. Well, first of all, long term, I'm not sure whether renting is actually more expensive than owning. But in a crisis situation, essentially what's happened to the mortgage holders is they were able to freeze a big part of their housing costs. So essentially they didn't have to pay them at all. Whereas the renters, that didn't happen. There was no kind of blanket legislation or agreement. I guess it was an agreement between the federal government and the banks that the banks would provide mortgage deferrals, but rents were still due. So I'm not sure. I'm trying to better understand your statement, because I think mortgage holders might have been better off.
Yes, it is, and there is actually like increasing in rent, like during the pandemic, a lot. Like the price for renting an apartment has been increased a lot. Like we studied on that in our previous research.
Right. So, anyways, I think there's a part of it that would be invisible to data, though. So there were evictions moratoriums, and an evictions moratorium is like a rent freeze, essentially, right? Or it could be like a rent freeze because people might be eligible to be evicted because they didn't pay their rent, and it's just not. This just doesn't show up in the data. So, anyways, there's some parts of this that you can't touch with the data, but nicely done. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That wraps up this this first session, and you did a fantastic job. Good work. And we'll now invite all those who are viewing from YouTube and Feedloop to make your way over to presentation 2.